Seattle always had a kind of quiet that made me feel smaller than whatever was waiting ahead. That morning was no different. Nothing hinted that just a few hours later, my life would be thrown straight into the eye of a storm, one I could not have imagined even in my worst dreams. I stood by the glass wall of my office, looking down at the streets still wet from last night's rain. The sky was gray, the air wasn't cold, just heavy in a way that's hard to explain. I tightened the old watch on my wrist, my mother's watch. Every time I touched it, I felt steadier. She passed away when I was 24, and that watch was one of the few things she left behind, still running even now. I had always seen it as a reminder that whatever happens, stay standing. I had worked at Westbrook Labs for nearly 30 years. I had lived through pharmaceutical storms, midnight recalls, and regulatory hearings where a single misstep could send an entire team's career off a cliff. I never claimed to be the best, but I knew I was someone this company could rely on. I knew every floor of the Seattle headquarters, and I knew every person who had weathered those impossible years alongside me. I did not think anything could shake me, not after everything I had survived, until that morning. Today was the first day of the new Chief Executive Officer, Lucas Randall, 40 years old, infamous across finance and biotech as the kind of man whose ambition cut sharp enough to draw blood. I had heard plenty about him, most of it unflattering, not because he lacked skill, but because he was the type who would cut off an entire branch just to make the quarterly report look pretty. Some people call that bold. To me, it looked more like a lack of humanity. Still, big companies learn to adapt to different kinds of leaders. I brought a bouquet of yellow tulips, the flowers I had always believed symbolized a new beginning, to greet him in the most civilized way I could. But the moment I stepped into the boardroom, silence wrapped around me like a cold blanket. I was used to meetings where people focused on the work, not on me. But this morning, they did not look at me with the usual respect. Eyes darted away. Notebooks closed without reason. Something was wrong. I sat down and placed the flowers in front of me, trying not to dwell on the strange tension filling the room. The door opened. Lucas walked in with two young assistants. He wore a suit so perfectly pressed, I wondered if someone ironed every crease for him each morning. He did not smile, did not acknowledge anyone long enough to make it meaningful. When his gaze paused on my flowers, the corner of his mouth lifted, not politely, but with a thin, controlled mockery. He sat down, set his tablet on the table, and began speaking without a single greeting. I straightened, waiting. The first part of his speech sounded like static, buzzwords from someone desperate to prove he was strong enough to reset everything. New culture, new direction, new spirit. But then he stopped and turned toward me. The air in the room tightened. He said my name, and I remember how he emphasized every word as if stamping punctuation onto my life. Emma Carter. 30 years is a long journey, but this company cannot move into a new era with old ways of thinking. Your presence no longer fits the vision I intend to build, and therefore, as of today, you are officially removed from your position. I heard a few sharp breaths. Someone dropped a pen and scrambled to pick it up, hoping no one noticed. I looked at him, waiting for a hint, a twitch, a smile, anything that this was a terrible joke. But Lucas was not the joking type. His eyes were cold and empty, like pushing someone out of a 30-year career was nothing more than checking a box on his to-do list. I do not remember how long I stayed still. A few seconds, maybe longer. My mother's watch kept ticking, the second hand moving steadily as if reminding me that no matter what, I had to stay intact. I set the flowers down and stood up. I did not say much. I did not let myself cry, even though my throat burned. I looked straight at Lucas and spoke with the calmest voice I could manage. Good luck. Such a simple phrase, it almost sounded hollow, but something strange happened. Lucas froze. Just slightly, just enough for me to see he did not like my reaction. Maybe he expected me to break down, beg, or explode. I did none of that. I walked out of the boardroom to the suffocating silence of everyone still seated, and when the door closed behind me, only one thought rang through my mind. They do not know. They have absolutely no idea what happened 2 days ago. Walking down the long hallway toward my office, I could still feel my heartbeat pounding too hard, reminding me this was only the beginning of a far bigger storm. Maybe you are listening to this and thinking I should have been furious, or at least deeply humiliated. Believe me, I ask myself the same question. But sometimes the moment someone thinks you have fallen is exactly the moment you rise clearer than ever. If you are following this journey, tell me where you are listening from. I have always been curious how stories like this find people in their own corners of life. And if you enjoy stories where quiet resolve and sharp silence can flip an entire board that looked rigged from the start, stay with me. Because of what happened next, I promise you will not want to miss. I left the boardroom with footsteps heavy as stone, but the story didn't begin there. Everything had already started moving 2 days earlier, on a Sunday night, so cold that I had to wrap myself in the old scarf my mother knitted nearly 30 years ago. I still remember I was about to make a cup of chamomile tea when my phone rang. The screen showed a name I never expected to see calling me so late at night: Claire Westbrook. Claire was the founder of Westbrook Labs, a woman with a kind of strength and resolve I had admired my entire life. If my bond with this company felt like family, then she was the spiritual mother of all of us. I answered immediately, unable to hide my worry. Her voice was weaker than I remembered, but it still carried that fierce clarity I knew so well. Emma, I need to see you. Tonight. No explanation, no preface, just a request. And I knew I could not refuse. 30 years of working with her had taught me one thing. If Claire called, something important was coming. I drove to her estate near Lake Washington. The road leading in was covered in shadows cast by tall trees, and the wind blowing off the lake stung my fingers. But the coldest thing was the sense of unease settling inside me. When the housekeeper opened the door, I saw Claire standing at the end of the hallway, leaning lightly on the wooden banister. She was thinner than before, her skin paler, but her eyes were still sharp, just like the first time I met her more than 20 years ago. A woman who had survived every storm the pharmaceutical world could throw, someone who had protected thousands of employees from ruthless takeovers. "You're here," Claire said, gesturing for me to follow her into her study. I had been in that room many times, but tonight it felt different. The walnut desk, the bookshelves rising to the ceiling, the black and white photographs of the early lab teams. It all felt like it was telling the story of a life I was lucky enough to witness. Claire sat in her leather chair and exhaled slowly. "The company is in trouble, Emma." I waited, trying to steady myself even as my heart pounded. Claire continued, explaining that major investment funds were pressuring her to fast-track projects she believed weren't safe yet. They wanted to shift the company's direction, and worse, they wanted control of the board through people who had no ethical commitment to this industry. She paused and looked directly at me. "I no longer have the strength to keep Westbrook Labs on the path I built, but this company needs someone responsible, someone with heart, and someone loyal, someone who hasn't been corrupted." I froze. I understood what she was saying, but I couldn't yet believe it. Claire opened her desk drawer and took out a set of documents. A thick envelope, clipped carefully together. "I have decided to transfer all my shares to you. 47% voting power. Every bit of it will belong to Emma Carter." I remember the sound of the wind hissing against the window at that exact moment, as if the room itself was waiting for my reaction. I was so stunned I had to brace my hand on the desk. I had never imagined owning the company. I just wanted to do my job, to protect the people I trusted. Power had never felt like something meant for me. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for this responsibility," I admitted. I was 52 years old. A part of me always feared being seen as outdated in a world that changed too fast. Feared that power might turn me into someone I didn't want to be. Claire said nothing at first. Then she stood and walked toward me. She placed a small box on the table. Inside was a pen engraved with my name: E. Carter. Trust and duty. When I picked it up, my hand trembled. It wasn't a gift, it was a vow. "Emma," she said softly, "I chose you not because you're perfect. I chose you because you're the only one who hasn't forgotten the true purpose of this field. You will protect this company from people who see nothing but profit. And I trust you." Her words hit the deepest part of me. I signed, not for power, but because I knew I couldn't let this company fall into the hands of those who didn't value human life. As the final stroke of the pen landed, it felt like the world shifted a little. Before I left, Claire placed her hand on my shoulder. Keep this a secret, until the moment you must speak. Let people reveal who they truly are. I walked out of her estate as the Seattle rain fell onto my mother's watch, each drop marking the start of a new chapter. I didn't know that just 2 days later, I would be standing in a boardroom, fired like some disposable leftover. But now, looking back, I understand why Claire told me to stay silent. She wanted the truth to reveal itself. And this morning, it finally began. I stepped into my office after that meeting feeling like I was walking through the hallway of a hospital where someone had just taken their final breath. The air was so empty, I could hear every tap of my shoes on the wooden floor. The familiar warm yellow lights no longer brought comfort. They only made the room feel as tired as I was. The desk had been there for nearly 30 years. Every scratch on its surface was a story. I sat down, and only when my hands touched the edge did the pain hit me. Not because I had been fired, but because of the way they did it, like brushing off an old object they no longer had use for. I opened the drawer and took out an old frame with a photo of our early team at Westbrook Labs. Everyone looked younger, full of hope. Many of them had moved on to other places, and some retired. When I looked at my younger face in that picture, it felt like someone tightened a hand around my heart. I began packing my things: the notebooks with yellowed pages, the reports I stayed up countless nights to prepare, the chipped ceramic mug gifted by the clinical development team. Every item felt like a farewell. I placed them into the cardboard box the assistant had handed me, with a look that was both sympathetic and afraid. When I stepped out to look for tape, I saw the glances around me, the same avoidance as in the boardroom. A man I had worked side by side with during the shipping crisis of 2007 rushed past me as if I carried a curse. A group of younger staff in the hallway lowered their heads when I walked by. I knew they cared about me, but they feared Lucas more. I didn't blame them. In any company, fear always outweighs loyalty. Back in my office, I saw two vice presidents standing in the hallway across from me. I had once promoted them during the hard years, when they were still inexperienced managers. I remembered guiding them, helping them through their early mistakes, shielding them when they messed up. But this morning, they stood there with their arms folded, faces blank. Mark gave me the smallest nod when our eyes met. Linda didn't bother pretending to be polite. I turned away and kept packing. When I picked up the project journal from 2012, the one filled with notes from nights I stayed up saving a batch of medicine from being recalled, something tight in my chest snapped. A weight pressed so hard I had to set the journal down. I leaned back in my chair and inhaled deeply, but it wasn't enough. My throat burned and my eyes stung. For years, I had taken pride in being strong enough to handle anything. But in that moment, I wasn't sure anymore. I almost cried. I felt too tired, too old, too outdated in a world that worshipped youth and speed. Then my hand brushed against my mother's watch. The cold metal spread through my skin, up into my mind. Its steady rhythm reminded me I had lived through worse pain. I closed my eyes for a few seconds, pulled in a breath, and when I opened them again, the tears had already retreated. Right then, my phone buzzed lightly. A message from Ava, the young employee I once protected from a false investigation 2 years ago. She had always been grateful, even though I never wanted credit. Her message was short. "Do you have a minute? I need to send you something," I replied immediately. A few minutes later, Ava sent an audio file. I didn't want to play it. I was afraid of what I would hear, but I knew I couldn't hide forever. I pressed play. Lucas's voice came through, clear and firm. "Emma is dead weight from the past. Keeping someone like her only slows us down. Westbrook Labs needs to be rebuilt, and to rebuild, you have to throw out the old." I tightened my grip on the phone until my knuckles turned white. So firing me wasn't just part of a reorganization. For him, it was a display of power. He wanted everyone to see that no one was irreplaceable. No one mattered more than his ambition. The door beside my office opened, and Grant stepped out. Grant, the vice president of finance. The man who had backed me strongly when I saved the 2016 project. But today, he stood in the hallway speaking loudly to a group of mid-level staff, loud enough for me to hear. "I told you. Emma is past her expiration date. This is a new era. If you can't adapt, you're out." Each word hit me like drops of acid. Not because what he said was cruel, but because I once considered him an ally. I had defended him from the board's criticism. I once believed he would be part of the next generation of leadership. Betrayal, I realized, hurts more than being fired. I looked down at my phone. Ava had sent another message. You should know this. Lucas doesn't just want to fire you, he wants to erase every trace of you from the company. I sank into my chair and went still for a few seconds. And then it became clear. This wasn't a leadership change. This was a purge. And I knew things were far worse than I thought. I sat in my half-empty office, the cardboard box beside me looking like a quiet reminder that my life was about to be packed up and moved elsewhere, just like an old file closed after it reaches its expiration date. But Ava's words kept echoing louder than the sting of betrayal. Lucas didn't just want to fire me. He wanted to erase my existence from this company's history. And when her new message popped up on my screen, I knew the truth was worse than anything I had imagined. Ava sent another batch of documents, internal files about a project I had only heard mentioned in passing these last few months. Project Horizon. Just reading the name made discomfort twist in my stomach. Horizon was being marketed as the crown jewel, a groundbreaking, immunomodulating therapy. $300 million in investment. Big funds from New York and San Francisco are betting heavily on it. But what froze me was the short line of text Ava added below. You need to look closely. There's something no one dares to say. I opened the first file. Pages of clinical trial data appeared, along with graphs and comments from the research team. I read page after page, each one tightening something inside my chest. Abnormal spikes in adverse reactions during Phase 2 and Phase 3. Several reports of severe liver impairment, and 3 cases of immune overreaction with potential fatality. I frowned. These numbers were impossible to ignore. I had been through enough projects to know the weight of every line in those reports. But what hit me even harder was the label stamped across them. Unverified. Not prioritized. Not prioritized. Not prioritized when the data might kill patients. I scrolled further. The research team had sent warnings 3 times. All 3 were dismissed. I read the project management's responses and felt my stomach drop into something cold and hollow. Proceed with trials. Do not delay the timeline. The investment board is watching. That wasn't the voice of dedicated scientists. That was the voice of someone obsessed with polishing a quarterly report. That was the voice of Lucas. I kept going through the emails Ava had attached. Many had their content deleted, leaving only fragments, as if someone had deliberately cleaned the trail. But every remaining piece pointed to one truth. Lucas wanted Horizon approved as fast as possible. He needed it to make noise in his first month as chief executive. He needed to prove to the investment funds that he deserved the position they helped him secure. And when I looked even closer, I noticed strange edits in the data. Side effect indicators lowered in unnatural ways, almost certainly altered. I wasn't a data specialist, but I knew exactly who had the authority and access to manipulate the numbers. Grant, the vice president of finance, the man holding the project's budget, the one who reviewed documentation before it went to the board, the same man who had just called me past my expiration date. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to steady the dizziness. All of this had happened right underneath me, while I foolishly believed I still had control. I felt a wave of shame rise in my chest. How had I missed this? How had I allowed Lucas to use me as a shield? He fired me in front of the board as a symbol of an outdated generation. But now I understand. Lucas was hiding something far more dangerous. If Horizon were approved with falsified data, the fallout could destroy the company. Not just collapsing stock, not just billions evaporating. Lives. Thousands, maybe millions of patients. I knew I had to confirm how deep the danger went. I called Dr. David Harris, who had been in the research division for nearly 15 years and was the most principled scientist I had ever worked with. He was the kind of man who put ethics above everything, including his own career. David answered after 2 rings. His voice dropped when I mentioned Horizon. Emma, he said, you shouldn't be looking at those files if you're still at the company. I exhaled. I'm not at the company anymore. A long silence followed, the kind that felt like someone had just received news about a family member falling gravely ill. Then he spoke. Then you need to know this. The data was altered, not just parts, a lot of it. Some severe adverse reactions were minimized or changed before the reports were submitted. I tried to escalate it, but was pushed out of the main review meetings. Are you certain, David? He inhaled sharply, as if bracing himself. You've known me for how many years? If I say I'm certain, it means it's worse than what you're seeing on paper. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the strength drain from my body. The things I feared most were true. Lucas wasn't just an ambitious executive, he was playing with human lives. And Grant, someone I once protected, was helping him do it. After I hung up, I sat so still I could hear the ticking of my mother's watch, each second echoing like a warning. For the first time since the firing, I felt genuinely shaken. I wondered if I had grown too weak, too naive, if I had spent 30 years convincing myself I was making a difference when maybe I had only been blind. But then I looked at the documents in front of me. I thought about the patients waiting for a safe drug. I thought about the researchers who had devoted their lives to the values Westbrook Labs was built. This was no longer my personal story. This was about the survival of all of them. I let out a long breath, feeling something settle into place inside me. I knew what I had to do, not for revenge, not to reclaim a title, but to stop a disaster from being hidden behind polished reports. I decided I would stand up. Even if it meant standing alone against the entire system, I would do what was right. I arrived at headquarters earlier than usual. Seattle was still wrapped in its winter fog, but the air inside the building felt entirely different. The 10th floor, where the board met, seemed to be waiting for a storm no one dared to name. Employees whispered about the emergency meeting as they passed by, and I knew Horizon was the reason everything had begun to spin so quickly. I stood in the hallway outside the boardroom, my back resting lightly against the frosted glass wall. Inside, footsteps, chairs scraping, papers shifting, all blended together. But what made everyone slow their pace as they walked past was the chair at the end of the conference table. The secretary had already placed a small plaque there, the lettering printed bold and unshakable like a declaration. Reserved, majority shareholder. I looked at that chair through the glass, calmer than I expected to be. No one inside the room had any idea the person meant to sit there was the same one they had pushed out the door only days ago. I was in no rush. The meeting needed to unfold exactly the way it was supposed to. Lucas entered with the familiar confidence of a man convinced the world was aligning itself to his blueprint. His gaze paused on the empty chair for a few seconds, satisfied. I could imagine his thoughts. The new shareholder was his ally, his backing, the leverage he needed to solidify his power. He had no idea that in less than an hour, that same chair would be the reason he fell apart. When the meeting began, Lucas stood and presented his plan for a bold and necessary restructuring. He talked about reshaping the leadership team, about eliminating outdated mindsets, slowing the company down, and about turning Westbrook Labs into the symbol of a new era. He never mentioned my name, but every word was aimed straight at me, like a velvet-wrapped blade. An older director, Franklin, cut him off. He asked about Horizon's risks, emphasizing the troubling signs in the Phase 3 data. The question sent a ripple through the room. Lucas had been hit where he was weakest, but he recovered quickly, wearing that same controlled confidence. All warnings have been reviewed. You don't need to concern yourself with that, he replied, his voice so calm it became suspicious. I watched through the glass. Several directors exchanged glances. They were not as easily steered as Lucas assumed. Excessive defensiveness was always the mark of someone hiding something. Then Grant rose to deliver the financial report. His voice carried a polished certainty, and numbers of stunning growth lit up the screen like a golden promise. But I knew the truth. Those perfect figures were nothing more than a layer of fresh paint hiding a concrete foundation full of cracks. Not everyone in the room was convinced. A few senior directors, veterans of too many industry scandals, stared at the flawless chart with wary eyes. They understood that when something looked too perfect, it meant something had been buried. I remained silent in the hallway, fingers lightly touching my mother's watch. Every time anxiety rose, I reached for it to steady myself. The second hand moved quietly across the aged face, even as my life spun through its sharp turns. The board secretary stepped out several times to collect more documents. She passed me and lowered her head, unsure whether she should ask why I was there. On her tablet, Notifications kept appearing about shareholder voting rights. When a new one flashed across the screen, her face drained of color. I recognized it instantly. The confirmation that Claire's transferred shares had been fully registered in the board system. She looked at me, saying nothing, but her bewildered eyes said everything. She knew I was the majority shareholder. The rest of the room did not. The noise inside suddenly shifted. Someone had asked an aggressive question. A chair scraped hard. Lucas was irritated. I could feel it as clearly as if I could hear his voice. With each passing second, the pressure in the room rose like steam in a tightened valve. The secretary inhaled, squared the documents in her hands, then glanced at me again. I did not nod. I did not speak. But she understood. It was time. As her hand touched the boardroom door handle, I felt the entire hallway tighten like a violin string pulled to its final limit. The door was about to open, and when it did, nothing inside that room would ever be the same again. The moment the boardroom door cracked open, the secretary stepped inside with a look anyone observant could read instantly, the kind of panic she had barely managed to hold together out in the hallway. The room had been loud only seconds before, directors arguing over Project Horizon like clashing blades. But when she took her place, her voice carried through the room with unnerving clarity. There is an important update regarding the ownership structure. The entire room fell silent. Lucas lifted his head, wearing the confident smile of a man expecting good news meant only for him. But that smile withered the second the secretary continued. The new holder of 47% of Westbrook Labs voting shares is Emma Carter. I had imagined this moment in my mind more than once, but nothing compared to that sudden, absolute silence. It wasn't the silence of shock, it was the silence of minds stopping all at once. Lucas shot to his feet. His chair screeched backward loud enough to startle one of the directors. His face drained of color, his lips parted, but nothing came out, as if someone had ripped the floor out from under him. Is there some kind of mistake? Franklin asked, his voice shifting from skepticism to genuine concern. The chief legal officer hesitated, then stood. He grabbed his tablet, swiped through the documents, checked the updated ownership log, then checked it again as if his eyes were lying to him. Finally, he looked straight at Lucas. There is no error. The transfer is valid. Legally processed and verified in the system 3 days ago. No one spoke another word. All eyes turned to Lucas, the man who had proudly declared the company was entering a new era, that old remnants needed to be removed. Now he was the one standing on the outside. Lucas inhaled sharply, but the breath caught in his throat. He trembled for a split second before forcing out a strained voice. This is manipulation. He raised his voice, cracking at the edges. She is trying to sabotage the power structure of this company. I demand an immediate investigation. No one answered. Watching from the doorway, I saw his hand clench so tightly his knuckles whitened. I knew exactly what was spinning through his mind. Horizon. The falsified data. The investment funds are breathing down his neck. The scandal that had wrecked his career once before. And now his entire comeback is pinned on one fragile plan. Then, in that tiny moment, his eyes darted to Grant. Grant, the man who had called me past my expiration date. The man who altered Horizon's numbers to save Lucas. And now, the man is standing frozen like a child caught stealing candy. Grant lowered his head instantly, avoiding Lucas's eyes like they were headlights in the dead of night. Lucas turned back to the board, his voice rushing, almost desperate. You cannot allow someone who was just terminated to walk back in and manipulate this company. This is a threat. The secretary swallowed hard. Sir Randall, Ms. Carter has manipulated nothing. These are her legally transferred assets, and by charter, the majority shareholder must be present in all executive sessions. The room broke into soft chaos. Some directors whispered to each other. Others looked down at the documents, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But slowly, every gaze shifted toward the door where I stood. I knew my moment had arrived. I pushed the door open. It was as if the room froze solid. No rustling papers, no sharp breaths, no shifting chairs. Only Lucas's horrified stare locked onto me, like I was a ghost he was certain he had erased. I didn't look at him yet. I walked straight to the end of the table, my mother's watch resting on my wrist, its steady ticking cutting through the chaos like a metronome of fate. I took the seat reserved for the majority shareholder. Not a word, not a challenge. I didn't need to. The silence in the room changed instantly. No longer chaotic, no longer panicked. It became heavy, sharp, the kind of silence that settles when power changes hands with finality. Lucas stood motionless, his face pale, his lips trembling as if he wanted to speak but no longer remembered how. The board stared at me, not with pity like the day I was fired, but with caution and respect. I placed both hands on the table. The room seemed to hold its breath. In that moment, every piece from the past 3 days aligned. The humiliation in the morning, the betrayal in the hallway, the truth behind Horizon, the empty chair, Lucas's fading confidence. I looked directly at him. Now, I said calmly, in a voice so steady it surprised even me, the real game begins. I sat still in the chair reserved for the majority shareholder, my hands laced together in front of me. No one spoke. No one even dared to breathe too loudly. Lucas remained standing, pale as if he had just seen the shadow of his own ambition collapsing. I opened the document case beside me, took out my phone, and placed it on the table. With a single tap, the recording Ava had sent me the night before filled the boardroom speakers. Lucas's voice cut through the room sharp as a blade. Emma is dead weight from the past. She slows everything down. This company will never move forward if we keep people as outdated as she is. The words echoed around the room like a moral death sentence. No one responded. Every gaze shifted toward Lucas, who now stood as though his feet had been nailed to the floor. I studied the faces around the table. Some directors were wide-eyed. Others frowned, unable to believe their CEO had spoken about a senior leader with such contempt. Even the ones who had thought of me as outdated looked unsettled. Lucas slammed his hand on the table. That recording is illegal. Who gave it to you? Ava. I will sue her. I will sue both of you, I answered calmly. You can sue if you want, but what you said, it is still the truth. Grant shot up from his seat, his voice climbing but trembling. She is fabricating this. One recording means nothing. I did not look at him. I opened my laptop and connected it to the large screen. All eyes locked on the display as the Horizon documents appeared. I am not here to argue feelings, I said. I am here with data. I began showing the pages one by one. On the screen was a comparison of Phase 3 results. On the left, the original data from the research team. On the right, the edited version that Lucas and Grant had submitted to the board. Even a casual glance revealed the truth. Entire lines of severe side effects were missing. Critical reports had been deleted. Several charts had been reshaped to shrink complication rates. This is evidence of data manipulation, I said, my voice neither raised nor harsh, but sharp enough to cut the air. These alterations are not only illegal, they put patient lives at risk. I object, Lucas shouted. No one is allowed to present internal documents after no longer being an employee. I looked straight at him. I am presenting as the majority shareholder, and more than that, as a human being. Grant tried to jump in, his voice cracking. This is invalid. She is doing this for revenge. I didn't answer Grant. Instead, I chose to make them face the truth entirely. I invite Dr. David Harris to join the meeting. A tone chimed. Dr. Harris's face appeared on the screen, tired but focused, with the same steady conviction he always carried. Dr. Harris, I asked, were the data sets you submitted altered in any way? He nodded. Yes, significantly. At least 8 high-risk categories were removed or rewritten before being forwarded to the board. The room erupted in whispers. A young director muttered, loud enough for all to hear, God, we almost endangered patients. Lucas spun toward Grant, rage tightening every muscle in his neck. What did you hide from me? Grant stumbled back half a step. I only followed your directions. No, Lucas barked. You manipulated the data without telling me. The room exchanged looks. No one believed that. Not one person. Then I spoke. Do not blame each other. Both of you know exactly what you did. Lucas turned on me. Face flushed red. You have no authority to question me. I am the chief executive. I placed both hands on the table and leaned forward. Not for much longer. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Directors straightened in their seats, recognizing what was about to happen. I displayed the next set of documents. Internal emails Ava recovered before they were wiped from the system. Emails from Lucas demanding that Horizon be accelerated, warnings removed, and negative reports contained. Grant stared at the screen with hollow eyes. He knew the last exit had closed. No one spoke for several moments as the truth settled like lead. Then Franklin placed his hand on the table, his voice ringing through the room. We nearly put patients at risk. We nearly allowed this company to walk into an ethical catastrophe, and all of it traces back to the decisions of the chief executive. Lucas stammered, No, no, you cannot. I looked around the room and saw resolve forming in their expressions. Some clenched their jaws, others looked at Lucas with deep disappointment. I knew exactly where they were headed. The legal officer cleared his throat. I move that the board vote to remove Mr. Lucas Randall from the position of Chief Executive Officer. A silence deeper than the waters of Lake Washington filled the room. The board had shifted, and this time it wasn't because of power, it was because of the truth. The room was still trembling from Franklin's motion to remove the chief executive. I looked around and saw the stares shifting from confusion to certainty. But I knew Lucas would never let things end quietly. He was not the kind of man who accepted defeat without a final strike. And just as I expected, Lucas lunged at his last chance like someone clinging to the edge of a cliff. Wait, he shouted, his voice cracking with panic masked as arrogance. All of you are being misled by someone who deliberately delayed a crucial project to protect her own interests. The room stirred in a wave of murmurs. Lucas pointed straight at me, his hand trembling but his intention unmistakable. She stalled Horizon in the early phase just to gain influence over the board. I have emails showing she tried to slow everything down. I exhaled softly. This was the blow he had saved for the final moment. He hoped to paint me as incompetent or worse, selfish enough to put my career above patience. I opened my folder and pulled out the original email thread he was trying to weaponize. I will save you the time, I said, calmly but loud enough for every ear. Yes. I delayed Horizon, and for the only reason any researcher or patient would ever want us to: safety. I placed the printed email on the table and projected it onto the large screen. In it, my own words read, Immune response markers are rising abnormally. Recommend a 14-day pause to reassess. We cannot advance to phase 2 without clarity on safety. I turned toward the board. If you want to investigate something, investigate me for this, for having the courage to say no. All eyes turned to Lucas, and for the first time I saw a true collapse in his expression. Not the collapse of a man defeated, but of a man who realized he had no shields left to hide behind. The legal officer rose to his feet. I have reviewed this email chain, and I confirm there is no evidence Mrs. Carter delayed the project for personal gain. Grant bowed his head, unable to form a single word. The atmosphere shifted. The tension that had stretched the room thin finally reached its breaking point. Franklin lifted his hand. I call for a vote. One by one, hands rose. 1, 2, 3, then 4. Each raised hand fell like a hammer on the coffin of Lucas Randall's career. 8 votes in favor, 1 against. The legal officer announced it without hesitation. The board hereby removes Mr. Lucas Randall from the position of Chief Executive Officer. The sound of pens signing was soft as wind, yet it carried the weight of ending a man who once believed he was untouchable. Grant was ordered to stand immediately afterward. You are suspended and placed under investigation for data tampering and concealment of risk. Grant turned white, his knees wobbling as if he were standing on thin ice. Lucas stared at me. His eyes burned, but beneath the anger was something unmistakable: fear. He stepped forward, gripping the table with both hands, as if it were the only thing holding him upright. You will regret stepping into my world, he hissed. You have no idea what awaits you. I met his gaze, not with anger, not with revenge, with truth. I am not stepping into your world, Lucas, I am fixing it. He froze for a moment, as if those words sliced the last piece of arrogance inside him. Then he turned away. No one escorted him out. No one said a word. When the door closed behind him, the room fell silent again. But this time, it wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence that follows truth. I left the boardroom, and the moment the door opened, I stopped in surprise. The hallway was full. The employees who once avoided me, who rushed past with lowered heads the day I was fired, now stood in a long line. They did not speak for several seconds. Then the applause began, not loud, not triumphant, but honest enough to tighten something in my chest. I thought I had grown accustomed to being alone on this battlefield, but in that moment I realized I had never truly been alone. Ava rushed toward me, eyes red. "Emma!" I thought they would destroy this company's future. I placed a hand on her shoulder. "It's over. You did the right thing." She hugged me. A real hug, without fear, without hesitation. And it made me feel something painful but true. Westbrook Labs had drifted far from the values it once stood for. Today, what I reclaimed was not a shareholder seat. It was the company's soul. Reeves, a board member, approached me. She placed a hand on my arm, her expression sincere. "Thank you, Emma. Not many have the courage to do what you did." I shook my head. "This wasn't courage, Reeves. It was simply what was right." I walked down the long hallway, my steps heavy but proud. On my wrist, my mother's watch ticked steadily, reminding me that victories don't always arrive with cheers. Sometimes they arrive in the quiet that follows truth. That day, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel victorious. I knew only one thing: a chapter had closed, and it was up to me to decide how the next one would be written. I did not go home after the meeting. My feet carried me to the 12th floor, the floor of the chief executive's office. The hallway was still and quiet, as if the entire building was holding its breath after the storm. When I opened the door, the large room unfolded before me. So silent, I could hear the Seattle rain tapping against the glass. I walked inside. This was not a space I had ever dreamed of, nor was it the victory people imagined. Standing in the middle of the room, I felt no triumph. What settled over me was responsibility, heavier than any seat of power. The large desk where Lucas once sat was now empty, save for a few papers abandoned in haste. "I am doing this for the real values," I whispered to myself. I opened my laptop and wrote my first email to the entire company, to all of Westbrook Labs. "Starting today, we will rebuild on 3 principles: transparency, fairness, and patient safety. I promise that no result will ever be built on fear or fraud. Thank you to those who chose honesty, even when it was difficult." I read it once more before hitting send. Next, I asked Human Resources to set up a company-wide meeting that afternoon. When I stepped onto the stage in the auditorium, hundreds of eyes turned toward me. There was no fear in them, only expectation. "We do not work for charts or deadlines," I said. "We work for patience, for people who place their hope for life in our hands. When we neglect ethics, we do not just fail, we can cause harm." No one spoke, but the silence carried weight. When I finished, applause rose through the hall. Not explosive, but the applause of people who felt the compass had pointed north again. After the meeting, I asked Ava to come to my office. She entered with her familiar timidity, but her eyes held a steadiness shaped by conviction. "Starting next week," I said, "you will take on the role of clinical data coordinator. You have proven you deserve that responsibility." Ava covered her mouth, her breath shaking. I never thought I could." "You can, and you will." I did not want to remove only those who were wrong. I wanted to lift those who were ready for what came next, those who stood for truth. When Ava left, I opened my inbox and wrote a handwritten note to Claire. "Aunt Claire, I kept my promise. I will protect your life's work the way you taught me, with honesty, not fear." I placed the envelope in the outgoing tray, hoping it would reach her before exhaustion did. Over the next 2 days, several people who had stood behind Lucas knocked on my door. They entered quietly, their faces lined with guilt. "Emma, I am sorry," one of them said. "I was afraid for too long." I looked at them carefully, long enough to see sincerity, then nodded. "I am not here to hold grudges. We need each other to rebuild." They exhaled in relief, some close to tears, but I knew no one was entirely innocent. Not them, not me. I had let my fear of being outdated keep me silent for too long. Forgiveness was as much for them as it was for me. A week later, I signed the official order. Project Horizon would be paused entirely and rebuilt from the ground up, not canceled. Rebuilt. I knew some investors would be unhappy, but they would have to adapt to a different Westbrook. That afternoon, when the building grew quieter, I walked to the window of the chief executive's office. Seattle was raining again, thin drops mixed with mist, just like the day I was fired. Just like the moment I stood in the hallway holding a small box with the fragments of 30 years inside it. But today, I was standing somewhere else. Not for revenge, not for triumph, but because I had become who I needed to be. The final guardian of the values Claire had placed into every brick of this company. I looked out at the city, at the lights shimmering through the rain like thin currents of brightness cutting through shadow, and I understood something simple. Sometimes life pushes you to the edge, not to end you, but to show you exactly where you are meant to stand. I turned back to my desk, resting my hand on my mother's watch. The second hand kept moving, and in that quiet moment, I spoke softly, not to anyone but myself. Power is not the loudest voice in the room. Power is when you stay silent, and the whole world listens.